The advisor stood before the tall, silver-framed glass, his reflection a portrait of tightly coiled anxiety. The familiar, opulent weight of his private chambers offered no comfort today. His mind was entirely consumed by the dangerous prospect of the shadow clerks. To summon such invisible, treacherous elements within the heavily guarded walls of the citadel was an invitation to the gallows. The matriarch's eyes were everywhere now, her influence seeping into the very mortar of the palace. If he needed to send a whisper into the deep underground, it had to be done beneath the open sky, far from the suffocating marble corridors where even the tapestries seemed to listen. He began the meticulous process of burying his identity. He draped a coarse, heavy woolen cloak over his narrow shoulders, ensuring the drab grey fabric completely smothered the fine, embroidered silks of his high station. He pulled the rough hood up, casting his weathered, calculating face into deep shadow. He was just adjusting a common linen scarf around his neck, attempting to mimic the posture of a weary merchant, when 3 sharp, rhythmic raps echoed from his heavy oak door. "Enter," Eleazar commanded, his voice tight, lacking its usual diplomatic smoothness. The heavy wood swung inward, revealing the imposing silhouette of his personal guard, fully clad in chainmail and dark iron plate. The soldier stepped into the room, his hand resting instinctively on his weapon. "This excursion will not take long," Eleazar said before the soldier could speak. He turned away from the mirror, smoothing the rough fabric of his cloak to hide any trace of velvet beneath. "We are simply visiting an old acquaintance in the lower districts, and then we shall return to the citadel. Look at me. Is my attire suitable? Would the common folk recognize my face if I walk among them?" The armored guard tilted his helmeted head, his gaze catching the faint light from the window. "The blood debt, my lord," the guard rumbled, a hint of unease woven into his deep voice. "You have left the glass file woven into the braids of your beard. Even hidden beneath a peasant's hood, the glimmer of that vial screams of the high bureaucracy. They will know you serve the silver throne." Eleazar froze. He raised a trembling hand to his chin, his fingers brushing against the cold, cylindrical glass hanging from his braided hair. Inside the tiny vessel, the thick, unnatural blue blood, the terrifying mark of Luria's brutal new regime, swirled sluggishly. He had grown so terribly accustomed to the grim accessory, to the constant reminder of his loyalty and his mortality, that he had forgotten to remove it. "You are right," Eleazar murmured, feeling a sudden flush of foolishness. With careful, methodical movements, he untied the leather cord and slipped the vial of blue blood deep into the concealed inner pocket of his tunic. Stripped of his official insignia, he felt suddenly naked, unprotected, yet profoundly relieved. "Which way are we heading, sir?" the guard asked, his armor clinking softly as he shifted his weight. "To the center of the city. The Grand Bazaar," Eleazar replied, adjusting his hood one final time to ensure his profile was completely obscured. "I will see my farrier friend. However, heed my words carefully. You cannot walk too closely to me. Trailing me from a distance will suffice. I must appear entirely alone." The guard shifted uncomfortably, the leather straps of his breastplate groaning under the tension. "My lord, is this risk worth taking, walking unguarded in the throng?" "You will do as I say," Eleazar snapped, his tone turning instantly to ice, leaving no room for debate. "Keep your distance." The advisor's harshness was not born merely from the fear of being recognized by the commoners. A darker, more isolating paranoia had taken root deep in his chest. In Drea's terrifying new era, trust was a fatal flaw. he could not risk this loyal soldier, or anyone else in the kingdom, witnessing the true nature of his errand in the market. The exchange he was about to make with the underground required complete, suffocating secrecy. He kept his silence, revealing nothing more. Leaving the oppressive shadow of the citadel behind, Ilazar descended into the sprawling belly of Lirnazan. The air was biting and frigid, a dry, unforgiving cold that stung the cheeks and turned breath into pale mist. Yet, a brilliant, unclouded midday sun washed over the cobblestone streets. The light offered a deceptive, visual warmth, illuminating the massive circular plaza that served as the city's pulsing mercantile heart. At the very center of the grand circle stood the silent, towering statues of Drea's ancient monarchs. Their weathered stone faces gazed down at the bustling, fleeting lives of the mortals below. Among them, newly carved and imposing, was the effigy of the late King Nerzal, his features frozen in stern judgment. At the base of these silent titans rested a large, ornate monument, a fountain shaped in the likeness of a woman pouring an endless stream of crystal water from a marble jug. The water sloshed and echoed, a constant soothing rhythm that fought against the chaotic roar of the crowd. Surrounding this central plaza was a tightly packed ring of commerce, a sensory assault of sights and smells. The acrid, sulphurous smoke of an alchemist's workshop drifted lazily into the cold air, mingling with the heavy, rich scent of tanned hides from the leatherworkers' wide stalls. Bursts of vibrant crimson and deep yellow fabrics marked the tailor's domain, a vivid contrast against the grey stone of the city. Dominating the auditory landscape was the rhythmic, deafening clatter of a heavy hammer striking a steel anvil, announcing the roaring fires of the farrier's forge. Further out, just beyond the ring of bustling shops, the wooden facade of a busy inn spilled raucous laughter and the smell of roasted meat into the frigid air, surrounded by an endless, sprawling sea of tightly packed residential houses with sloped slate roofs. The plaza was overflowing with life. Merchants bellowed their exaggerated prices. Citizens haggled aggressively over rough-woven cloth and winter-root vegetables, and the grey cobblestones vanished completely beneath a sea of moving bodies. Yet, what truly set Ilazar's nerves on a razor's edge was the heavy, undeniable military presence. Squads of city guards, their long halberds gleaming viciously under the harsh sun, patrolled the perimeter of the circle in tight, disciplined formations. Their vigilant eyes swept through the civilian tide, hunting for the slightest hint of unrest or treason. Pulling his coarse hood lower over his brow, Ilazar took a deep, steadying breath. He stepped off the main avenue and plunged directly into the chaotic, noisy throng, letting the massive crowd swallow him whole. Somewhere far behind him, his armored shadow followed, but Ilazar deliberately did not look back. His eyes were fixed intently on the farrier's billowing forge, the agreed meeting ground where the invisible threads of the underground awaited his coin. The rhythmic, unrelenting strike of a heavy hammer against an iron anvil guided Ilazar through the final stretch of the bustling market. He navigated the chaotic, shifting sea of merchants and commoners toward the open-fronted workshop of the blacksmith. Unlike the enclosed boutiques of the tailors, this forge bled its intense heat directly into the frigid street, pushing back the winter chill. At the center of the fiery glow stood the smith. He was an old wolf of the trade, a man whose age was measured not in frailty, but in seasoned, hardened experience. Long, coarse white hair was tied back from his soot-stained face, and a thick, snow-colored beard tumbled down his chest, catching the amber light of the dancing flames. He stood before the massive anvil, rhythmically bringing his hammer down upon a glowing bar of raw steel, slowly coaxing the lethal curve of a broadsword from the molten metal. Far behind the cloaked advisor, maintaining a rigid and deliberate distance, walked his personal honor guard. The towering soldier lingered near the edge of a spice vendor's stall, a silent, imposing sentinel wrapped in dark iron. The bustling crowd intuitively parted around him. A passing patrol of regular city watchmen, clad in their simple boiled leather and standard-issue halberds, immediately halted upon spotting the elite plate armor. They snapped to attention, bringing their fists sharply to their chests in a crisp, respectful salute, acknowledging the vast gap in military hierarchy before moving on. The honor guard barely offered a nod, his vigilant gaze fixed entirely on Ilazar's distant, hooded figure. Ilazar stepped into the oppressive warmth of the forge. The blacksmith's eyes remained entirely locked on the cherry-red steel beneath his hammer. Yet the old man possessed the uncanny instincts of a survivor. Without lifting his head, without breaking his punishing rhythm, he sensed the shift in the air. He recognized the heavy, calculating presence of his most secretive client beneath the rough peasant cloak. A shower of orange sparks rained across the packed dirt floor as Ilazar stepped closer, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the roar of the furnaces. "How many will this sword hunt?" the advisor asked, pulling his cowl slightly tighter around his face. The blacksmith brought the hammer down with a resounding clang. "I could not say, my lord," the old man replied, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that matched the grind of a whetstone. "It depends entirely on how many its master wishes to hunt. My steel sets no limits upon its wielder. How are you today?" Ilazar let out a heavy, weary exhale, the exhaustion of the citadel finally bleeding into his posture. "Do not ask, do not even ask. I find myself in a terrible measure of trouble." The hammer paused for a fraction of a second, hovering above the glowing blade. "What has happened, my lord? Is it a matter my tools can solve? Take a seat on the bench if you wish. My current fold will not take long." "No, there is no need. I cannot stay long," Ilazar replied quickly, casting a wary glance over his shoulder at the oblivious crowd passing the open storefront. "I have 2 requests of you. Can you manage them?" The blacksmith let out a soft, knowing chuckle, though his eyes never left his work. The hammer resumed its punishing song. "Usually you only ask for 1 favor at a time. You have me intensely curious about the second. I do not know what these tasks are yet, and I can likely achieve them. But the payment might multiply." "Coin is not an issue," Ilazar dismissed coldly. He stepped a fraction closer to the anvil, forcing his voice into a harsh whisper. "The Matriarch has initiated certain new enterprises, namely unleashing the Shadow Clerks upon her own administration. We are being audited in the dark. I cannot root this out from within the walls of the citadel without drawing the executioner's blade. I want you to gather every shred of information you can find on these men." The blacksmith simply nodded, a slow, deliberate tilt of his white-haired head. The hammer struck the steel, shaping the edge. "And what is the other matter, my lord?" Ilazar swallowed hard. The next words felt like swallowing jagged glass. "I want you to loose a whisper on the wind. Just a rumor. But this whisper must travel far. It must reach the Amaru tribes, and most importantly, it must reach the ears of the dragon, Rakkanix. Is it within your power to accomplish this?" For the first time, the blacksmith stopped. He lowered his heavy hammer, resting the iron head upon the anvil, and wiped a soot-stained forearm across his sweating brow. He let out a long, slow breath. This is a treacherous path. I will attempt it, but the toll will be extraordinarily heavy. A request of that magnitude threatens to expose my deepest connections. What is the nature of this whisper? Spread the word through the Undercity and beyond the borders that Drea has crowned a new ruler, Ilazar instructed, his eyes burning with a dangerous, calculated light. Embellish the tale. Let them say the new sovereign looks favorably upon the Amaru. Ensure the message is dripping with praise and the promise of a warm embrace. The old wolf narrowed his eyes, processing the lethal political game his client was playing. Understood, my lord. And what is the reaction you are expecting from this? If the dragon Rakkanix feels a sense of honor and joy upon hearing it, Ilazar said softly, then the task is complete for you and your network. Consider it done, my lord, the blacksmith replied, gripping his hammer once more. Which district am I excavating this time? Ilazar reached beneath his heavy woolen cloak and retrieved a small, tightly crumpled piece of parchment. He pressed it into the blacksmith's calloused, blackened palm. Dig at the coordinates marked here. I am fully aware of the immense risks attached to my second request. The silver buried in that chest will be more than enough to satisfy your network. The blacksmith slipped the parchment into a thick leather pouch at his belt. I thank you. Tell me, my lord, these men they have put on your trail, what magnitude of trouble are they? Ilazar's expression darkened beneath his hood, his mind flashing to the blue blood hidden in his tunic pocket. Dangerous enough that they will ensure I can never do business with you again. Handle the matter. Understood clearly, the blacksmith said, returning his hammer to the glowing steel. The conversation officially terminated. Return to me in 1 week. I will tell you everything you wish to hear. Without another word, Ilazar turned his back to the blinding heat of the forge. He did not linger. He plunged directly back into the freezing air and the chaotic press of the bazaar, his boots moving swiftly over the cobblestones. The claustrophobia of the massive crowd, which had offered him a blanket of anonymity only moments before, now felt suffocating. Every face seemed like a potential spy, every shadow a clerk of the crown. He wove through the throngs of haggling merchants and wandering citizens, keeping his head down until he reached the wider, less congested avenue leading back toward the towering spires of the palace. A moment later, the heavy metallic tread of boots fell into step a few paces behind him. The honor guard had seamlessly reacquired his target. Ilazar did not stop walking, nor did he turn his head to acknowledge the armored giant. He simply spoke into the biting wind, his voice a ragged whisper. Not a word. We return to the citadel. The grand cavernous expanse of the throne room was swallowed by a suffocating heavy silence, yet Matriarch Luria was nowhere near the imposing silver seat of power. Instead, she had retreated to the deeper, colder shadows at the far end of the chamber, hunched over a massive oak desk carved with the ancient, snarling heraldry of her bloodline. The flickering, erratic golden tongues of wall-mounted torches provided the only illumination, casting long, restless shadows that danced across her pale face like mocking specters. The agonizing, sensory-altering silver crown was absent from her brow tonight, leaving her sharp features exposed, stripped of their heavy metallic majesty. Spread before her, illuminated by the trembling firelight, was a chaotic, sprawling sea of crumbling parchment, thick vellum, and cracked leather-bound ledgers. These were the intimately detailed, closely guarded administrative archives of her late father, King Nerzal. For 3 decades, Luria had existed strictly on the periphery of this vast bureaucracy. She had observed the intricate architecture of his kingdom from the outside, studying its broad strokes from a distance, only to draft its total ruin in the dark corners of her mind. But now, looking at the raw, unfiltered arithmetic of a kingdom's survival up close, a corrosive, bitter realization set in. She was navigating a labyrinth she had only ever seen from above. The sensation of new learning, of discovering the hidden grinding gears of a political machine she had already violently conquered, tasted like ash in her mouth. She loathed it with a visceral, burning intensity. In Luria's rigid, unforgiving worldview, to be entirely ignorant was a simple, easily corrected weakness, but to possess fragmented, incomplete knowledge was a lethal vulnerability. It was a predator, waiting patiently in the blind spot of her vision. A ruler who had to guess was a ruler waiting to be dethroned. Driven by an insatiable, almost violent ambition and the deeply rooted ideals she had nurtured in profound isolation, she tore through the crumbling texts, desperate to conquer the unknown. She read not with a scholar's curiosity, but with a tyrant's malice, seeking to forcefully dominate the information. Her pale, slender fingers traced the faded, spidery ink of a vast logistical report detailing the kingdom's enslaved populace. Luria viewed these countless nameless lives not as breathing souls, but as unrefined, malleable ore, waiting to be forged into the foundation of her new Drea. She sought ruthless efficiency, a cold method to extract every solitary drop of utility from their broken backs. Yet, her eyes caught upon a heavily redacted margin note, a bureaucratic anomaly she had never encountered during her years of silent observation. The condemned, categorized as unskilled, sentenced to the dark. Reading further through the transcribed secret dialogues between Nirzal and his former ministers of state, a chilling truth slowly unspooled beneath her fingertips. These specific slaves were not the physically weak, the diseased, or the truly useless. They were the defiant. They were charismatic dissidents, natural leaders, and instigators whose rhetoric was deemed too infectious, too dangerous to be killed in the public square, lest their public executions turn them into martyrs for the wretched masses. Instead, to prevent the creeping rot of rebellion from spreading through the labor camps, they had been quietly erased. They were thrown into a forgotten, lightless oubliette built directly beneath the very citadel where Luria now sat. The revelation sent a cold thrill, intricately woven with a bitter, defensive resentment down her spine. Luria herself was an insurgent. She was the ultimate usurper who had shattered the old, stagnant order and dragged the nobility to their knees. She certainly did not consider herself unskilled. These condemned rebels, there was a raw, volatile energy locked away in the suffocating dark beneath her boots. She needed to harness it. She needed to bend that charismatic defiance, that weaponized anger, to the will of the silver throne. She closed her eyes, forcing her brilliant, demanding mind to weave these forgotten prisoners into her grand, bloody tapestry. But the threads would not align. The vision stubbornly resisted her. She despised this specific tormenting feeling, the agonizing friction of a halted thought. In the ancient theoretical tomes of statecraft and warfare she had consumed throughout her youth, strategy flowed with a flawless, crystalline mathematics. Variables fell perfectly into elegant equations. Every action had a predictable, devastating reaction. Reality, however, was currently refusing to yield to her intellect. The solution hovered just out of reach, heavily shrouded in the thick, suffocating fog of her own incomplete information. Her jaw tightened, until her teeth ached. A low, venomous mutter escaped her lips, her voice a serpent's hiss in the quiet room as she began to actively argue with the unseen, abstract obstacles in her mind. Unable to remain seated while her thoughts tangled into a chaotic knot, she violently pushed the heavy oak chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the stone floor, a harsh sound in the quiet chamber. She rose and began to walk. The measured, thoughtful steps quickly escalated into a frantic, predatory pacing. Back and forth across the rich woven rugs she marched, her heavy boots striking the floor in a relentless, aggressive rhythm. She was tracing the perimeter of an invisible, maddening cage. Her mind was spinning at a terrifying, self-destructive velocity, hunting for the ideal maneuver, the perfect tactical exit from this mental labyrinth, yet continuously crashing against the unyielding walls of missing data. She had to do better. She had to see further. This natural, arduous process of problem-solving, the clumsy trial and error of thought, felt like a profound, personal insult to her intellect. It drove her to the very precipice of blinding rage that the correct answer, the perfect design, was not simply bestowed upon her, fully formed and immaculate. The friction was a failure, and Luria did not tolerate failure, least of all within the confines of her own mind. Thud, thud, thud. 3 heavy, resonant knocks struck the thick timber of the throne room's outer doors. The sound hit Luria like a physical blunt-force blow to the skull. The fragile, spinning architecture of her intense focus shattered instantly into 1,000 useless, scattered pieces. The frantic pacing stopped abruptly in the center of the room. Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white with suppressed fury. The intrusion was a profound violation, an unforgivable theft of her already struggling concentration. "Come," she snarled. The command tore from her throat with a harsh, grating hostility, a sound so abrasive it seemed to lower the temperature of the cavernous hall. The massive doors groaned heavily inward, admitting a single, armor-clad royal guard. He stepped forward, his posture rigid but clearly hesitant, his instincts screaming at him as he sensed the deeply venomous, volatile atmosphere radiating from the furious woman standing in the shadows. "My lady," the guard announced, his voice tight and carefully controlled. "Chief Advisor Ilazar awaits your presence." Luria's eyes narrowed into terrifying, predatory slits. Her mind was still agonizing over the locked dungeon beneath the floorboards, bleeding from the friction of her own tangled thoughts. "Bring him in." Ilazar stepped cautiously into the cavernous chamber, his movements unusually timid. Before the advisor could even part his lips to announce himself, Luria struck. "I shall show you mercy, Ilazar," she snapped, her voice trembling with a hostile, aggressive energy. "Provide me with the correct answer, and do it swiftly." Ilazar turned to stone. His blood ran ice-cold as a singular, paralyzing thought seized him. Execution. He fought a violent internal war to keep his weathered face impassive, burying the pure terror that was tightening his chest. Luria did not let him breathe. "I know of the condemned slaves held in the oubliette beneath this citadel. Their final fate is unwritten in these ledgers. Are they still rotting down there?" A dizzying wave of profound relief washed over the advisor. He had braced for the gallows, not an administrative inquiry. Relaxing his rigid posture, he exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Great Matriarch, yes, they remain in the dark." "Good," she murmured. "The reports demand their execution, yet no final decree was stamped. Why?" When the late king's illness took root, his mind clouded. He could no longer dwell on such heavy matters, and eventually he forgot them entirely. To spare him the burden, I never sought the royal seal. The mandate for their deaths now simply awaits yours." "Understood," Luria whispered. She closed her eyes, resting her chin upon pale fingers as she retreated into the silent architecture of her mind. The mental friction vanished. The puzzle pieces violently snapped into place. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto Ilazar with a terrifying clarity. "They will not be executed." Ilazar's jaw slackened in genuine unfiltered shock. "But my lady," he stammered, stepping forward, desperate to explain the madness of keeping the rebellion's leaders alive. Luria's voice left no room for debate. "We are descending to the oubliette, together. I intend to look upon each of them, and you will provide a meticulous accounting of their histories. Summon the warden who oversees this rot immediately. I will know every secret they hold." A fleeting shadow of hesitation crossed Ilazar's weathered face, a brief flicker of the dread he fought to suppress. He quickly buried his unease, bowing low. "As you command, great matriarch." He hastily retreated from the oppressive throne room, his mind racing with the perilous variables of this sudden inspection. Navigating the winding, torch-lit corridors of the citadel, Ilazar intercepted a patrol of 3 armored sentries. He approached them with breathless urgency. "The matriarch moves to the lower dungeons," he ordered sharply. "You are to escort her at once, all 3 of you." Without waiting for their acknowledgement, the advisor turned and practically sprinted toward the spiraling stone stairs. He vanished into the damp gloom of the lower levels, desperate to reach the iron cells and prepare the warden before Luria arrived. Moments later, Luria emerged from the heavy doors of her hall. The 3 sentries were already waiting in the corridor. They struck their breastplates in a unified, resounding salute, seamlessly forming a tight ring of iron and drawn steel around her as the matriarch began her descent into the dark. The pristine, immaculate opulence of the upper citadel faded into a distant, mocking memory with every spiraling step the matriarch took downward. Up above, the silver throne bathed in the warm golden glow of hundreds of scented wax candles, the air thick with the aroma of expensive myrrh and the quiet hum of royal privilege. The architecture there was designed to inspire awe, built from smooth, heavily veined white marble. But down here, the aesthetics of power gave way to the brutal, utilitarian architecture of cruelty. The polished stone abruptly transitioned to rough-hewn, weeping granite. The temperature plummeted precipitously, the air growing heavy, damp, and suffocating. It was thick with the metallic tang of rusted iron, the foul stench of stagnant water, and the undeniable, lingering odor of generations of despair. Luria walked dead center within her heavily armored escort, her footfalls deliberate and rhythmic against the ancient, uneven stone stairs. Upon her brow rested the agonizing instrument of her sovereignty, the heavy, silver crown of Drea. The wide metal band deliberately covered her eyes, rendering her physically blind to the mundane world of fading light and creeping shadows. Yet, in this suffocating abyss, sensory deprivation was not a vulnerability. It was a profound, terrifying advantage. The crown severed her connection to visual distractions, drastically heightening her preternatural senses. She navigated the encroaching pitch black not with eyes, but by perceiving the subtle, shifting architecture of the world around her. The variations in air pressure, the faint echoes of heartbeats, and the ambient temperature of living bodies trapped in the dark. The total absence of light meant nothing to a predator who hunted entirely by intuition. At the base of the spiraling stairwell, in a cavernous, moisture-slicked antechamber that served as the throat of the oubliette, Chief Advisor Ilazar paced like a trapped animal. He stood intimately close to the head warden, a hulking, heavily scarred brute whose entire existence was measured in iron chains and heavy padlock keys. The two men were huddled together, their voices reduced to anxious, frantic whispers, desperately trying to anticipate the unpredictable, often lethal whims of the usurper queen descending upon them. "Attention!" barked one of the three honor guards, taking the final steps, his deep voice echoing violently off the damp, curved walls. "Matriarch Luria approaches." Ilazar instantly snapped into a rigid, breathless posture of absolute subservience, swallowing a heavy lump of dread. The warden scrambled backward, frantically grabbing a sputtering, pitch-soaked torch from a rusted wall sconce, standing at stiff attention with his head bowed low. Luria descended the final crumbling stone steps with agonizing, deliberate slowness, her posture radiating an effortless, terrifying dominance. The environment was an acoustic nightmare. Every clink of the guard's chainmail, every heavy, nervous breath from the warden reverberated endlessly through the lightless, labyrinthine corridors. She finally came to a halt. Without the meager, desperate halo of the warden's torch and a few widely spaced, dying sconces along the far walls, the subterranean void would have been total and absolute. For 10 long, agonizing seconds, Luria stood perfectly still. To the anxious men watching her, she appeared as a silent, blind statue carved from ice. But beneath the silver visor of her crown, her brilliant, calculating mind was aggressively mapping the vast, miserable expanse before her. She mentally traced the spatial dimensions of the heavy iron cages. She sensed the cold, hollow voids of the empty cell blocks, and more importantly, she felt the hot, wretched clusters of life in the occupied ones. Without opening a single eye, she identified exactly which prisoners were huddled on the floor in catatonic despair, and which ones were pacing the perimeters of their cages with the restless, kinetic energy of cornered beasts. "Speak to me, Warden," Luria commanded softly, her voice cutting through the damp chill like a freshly honed executioner's blade. Why were these specific slaves condemned to the block? What grave offense did they commit to exhaust the limits of royal patience? The warden cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting toward Ilazar for a brief moment of support before settling back on the blindfolded matriarch. "My lady, the populace held within this specific sector attempted to incite a widespread rebellion." Luria tilted her head a fraction of an inch, her unseen gaze piercing the heavy air between them. "The group held here? Are you implying there are other factions of insurgents?" "Yes, my lady," the warden admitted, his thick knuckles turning white around the shaft of the torch. "Your late father, King Nerzal, recognized the severe threat they posed when unified. He meticulously severed their networks, scattering the rebel leaders to disparate, isolated dungeons across the far corners of the kingdom. He firmly believed that together, their resolve was unbreakable. Even within this very oubliette, if you proceed down the hall, you will notice several blocks of entirely empty cells, deliberately separating the occupied ones. We keep them distanced, so they cannot whisper, cannot tap messages on the stone. They are exceedingly dangerous, my lady. They possess a terrifying capacity to organize rapidly." Luria began to walk forward, ignoring the warden's trembling explanations. Drawn by a specific, volatile energy signature radiating from one of the isolated iron blocks, she approached the rusted bars, her imposing presence causing the shadows to dance wildly in the erratic torchlight. Within the freezing cell stood a slave of the Tesar race. His skin was a striking, ethereal shade of pale violet, a color that stood in stark, tragic contrast to the thick layers of grime and filth of his subterranean confinement. But the most prominent, horrifying feature was the heavy, arcane collar, locked securely around his neck. The metallic device pulsed with a blinding, sterile white luminescence, casting harsh, unearthly shadows across his gaunt, angular face. The collar was not merely a physical restraint forged of iron, it was a parasitic, magical mechanism designed specifically for the Tesar biology. It actively siphoned their innate mental prowess, violently suffocating their telepathic and high cognitive abilities to render them docile and confused. Despite the agonizing, constant drain of the glowing white iron, this particular Tesar did not project an aura of defeat. He was severely emaciated, his ribs pressing sharply against his bruised purple skin, yet his posture remained rigid, with an unyielding, unbroken defiance. He radiated a palpable, simmering fury, standing near the bars like a coiled, venomous serpent. He looked exhausted, yes, but not broken. "They wear collars of arcane suppression," Luria noted coldly, stopping mere inches from the iron grate, feeling the heat of the white magic against her skin. "Their innate powers have been violently stripped from them. How, then, does a crippled, blinded populace initiate a coordinated uprising? What precisely did they attempt to do?" The warden hurried to her side, deliberately maintaining a safe distance from the bars. "This entire wing of the oubliette was constructed exclusively to house the Tesar insurgents, my lady. In the opposing wing, across the central chasm, we keep the golem slaves. The Tesar are lethally intelligent. Even suppressed, they can organize and strategize in fractions of the time it takes ordinary men. The golems, conversely, possess limited intellect, but pose a catastrophic physical threat due to their sheer, mountainous size. A faction within this specific Tesar group managed to circumvent our surveillance. First, they established a covert, non-verbal network of communication. Then, they actively plotted to breach the opposing wing to release the golem laborers. Their objective was to weaponize the giants, creating a bloodbath of total chaos to cover their own escape. Furthermore, our interrogators discovered they were painstakingly working on a rudimentary methodology to pick the arcane locks on their collars. And for this calculated ambition, my father sentenced them to death, Luria asked, her tone completely devoid of judgment or emotion. Exactly so, great matriarch, the warden confirmed, nodding vigorously. Luria stood in silence for a long moment, the flickering amber light of the torch playing across the cold silver of her crown. The gears of her mind turned, calculating the vast potential locked behind these rusted bars. Fascinating. Bring this one out of his cage. The tense atmosphere in the corridor instantly shattered. Ilazar stepped forward, his carefully maintained diplomatic composure dissolving into genuine, unfiltered panic. But matriarch, these creatures are filthy, treacherous insects. We cannot possibly permit one to be brought out, not in such close proximity to your royal person. It is too unpredictable. I said, bring him out, Luria repeated. The command was absolute, carrying the crushing weight of a physical blow. She didn't raise her voice, but the icy, unquestionable authority vibrating in her words brokered no further argument. Ilazar swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he instantly stepped back. He threw a frantic, desperate hand signal to the 3 honor guards positioned behind the matriarch. Be ready. The heavily armored sentries subtly shifted their stances, their thick leather gloves resting casually but firmly on the pommels of their broad swords, fully prepared to butcher the purple-skinned slave at the very first twitch of aggression. With a trembling hand, the warden produced a heavy iron keyring from his belt. He stepped up to the block, the internal mechanism groaning in loud protest as he unlocked the reinforced door. It swung outward with a screech of rusted hinges that echoed painfully down the hall. The Tesar did not cower in the corner. He stepped forward, out of the shadows and directly into the corridor. He was breathing heavily, the sound ragged and harsh in the echoing silence of the dungeon. His chest heaved with deeply suppressed rage, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of his oppressors. He did not utter a single syllable. He merely stood there, glaring intensely at the blindfolded matriarch, his eyes burning with an ancient, deeply rooted hatred that transcended fear. Slowly, deliberately, Luria reached out. Her pale, slender hand floated through the damp air and found the Tesar's face. The slave flinched instinctively, deeply unsettled and repulsed by the physical contact, but the menacing presence of the 3 drawn blades behind her kept him rooted to the stone floor. Luria's fingers firmly traced the sharp angles of his jaw, feeling the rigid tension in his muscles. She forcefully tilted his head from side to side, her thumb brushing against the pulsing, hot edge of the arcane collar, inspecting him as if he were a curious artifact or a piece of livestock on an auction block. The violation of the gesture was palpable. The Tesar was visibly trembling, caught between the instinct to strike and the agonizing restraint of his collar. "What is your name?" Luria asked smoothly, her hand still resting possessively upon his violet cheek. Silence. The slave stared fiercely through her silver visor, his jaw locked shut in a grim line. After several agonizing seconds of quiet, Ilazar's fragile nerves finally snapped. "Answer the great matriarch, you wretched, filthy insect," he bellowed, his voice cracking slightly with stress, the echo bouncing wildly off the ceiling. The Tesar remained completely unresponsive, treating the screaming advisor as if he were nothing more than a foul gust of wind. Luria calmly withdrew her hand, unbothered by the silence, and turned her blindfolded face back toward the warden. "What is he called?" "His name is Gige, my lady," the warden answered quickly, eager to please. "He is extremely dangerous, a known instigator." "No creature is truly dangerous while an arcane collar chokes the life from its throat," Luria replied, her voice smooth and conversational. She stepped even closer to Gige, entirely invading his personal space, her tone shifting into a calculated, manipulative cadence. "I am intimately familiar with the formidable intellect and the unique capabilities of the Tesar race, Gige. I know exactly what your people are capable of. So much so that I find your current state to be a tragic waste of resources. I know that your kind is far too valuable to be squandered. You are not meant to break rocks in the deep mines like a hulking, mindless golem, nor are you meant to toil in the sun-baked fields or perform the menial labor of common beasts." Hearing the fundamental nature of his people analyzed, categorized, and commodified so clinically by the very usurper who held their chains was the final, devastating strike against his restraint. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of her assessment broke the dam of his long-held silence. He was vibrating with a rage so profound, so pure, it threatened to consume him from the inside out. The armored guards instantly tightened their grips on their blades, the metallic slide of swords leaving scabbards whispering in the dark, their eyes locked on the slave's tense muscles. "You have annihilated everything I ever loved," Gige hissed. His voice was raspy, broken from years of disuse, but it dripped with pure, unadulterated venom. "You have taken the honor of the Tesar and shattered it into bloody dust. I cannot find my son. You tore him from my arms. You have systematically stripped us of every single thing that made us whole. There is no action you can take, no grand design you can build in that rotting mind of yours that will ever compensate for the devastation you have wrought upon us." Gaige's venomous words hung heavily in the subterranean chill, echoing against the weeping granite like a cursed prophecy. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with the expectation of immediate, brutal violence. The armored honor guards tensed, their knuckles white as they gripped their broadswords, waiting for the Matriarch to order the insolent creature's summary execution. Instead, Luria did something entirely unexpected, something that sent a jagged shard of ice straight through Ilazar's heart. She turned her blindfolded face slowly toward her chief advisor, and she smiled. It was a profoundly disturbing expression, an asymmetric, chilling curvature of her pale lips that contained absolutely no warmth, no amusement. It was the calculated, deeply unsettling grin of a grand architect observing a complex trap finally snapping shut. Ilazar's diplomatic composure shattered. A cold sweat broke across his brow. Desperate to reclaim control of the spiraling situation, he stepped forward, his voice tight with panic. "My lady, we cannot possibly permit this filthy insect to hurl such vile insults at your royal person and your kingdom. Give the command. The moment you press your royal seal to their death warrants, we can eradicate this entire pestilence from the realm." Luria ignored the terrified statesman completely. Her terrifying smile lingered as she slowly rotated her head back toward the bruised, purple-skinned captive. "The cogs of the grand mechanism I have designed are turning flawlessly, and they shall continue to grind forward," Luria stated, her voice echoing with a hypnotic melodic authority that commanded absolute attention. "In the new Drea, every single entity will perform its designated function to the absolute limit of its capacity. This kingdom has no need for a massive surplus of idle flesh. Furthermore, it possesses zero tolerance for mindless, unthinking labor." She stepped closer, the heat of the arcane collar practically radiating against her skin. "You, Gaige, you, and every fully equipped, intellectually capable individual of the Tesar race currently rotting in these cells will swear fealty. You will serve the Silver Throne, and you will do so with unparalleled excellence. Even though you are a restricted, subjugated faction, your living conditions will drastically improve. Your comfort will be elevated. Your security will be guaranteed. Drea is a state that generously rewards any individual who surrenders their entire being to its cause, and it never forgets a debt. You will pour every ounce of your intellect, every drop of your vitality into serving this kingdom. And when the proper time arrives, you shall undoubtedly receive the grand recompense I have envisioned for your kind." A stunned, suffocating bewilderment washed over the damp corridor. The heavily scarred warden blinked, his jaw slack in sheer disbelief. The heavily armed sentries exchanged confused, nervous glances beneath their iron visors. Even Gaige, the hardened insurgent leader, was profoundly shocked by the proposition, though he fought a monumental internal battle to keep his angular face completely impassive. But it was Ilazar who looked as though he had been physically gutted. Without allowing the suffocating tension to settle, Luria delivered the final, earth-shattering blow. "These captives will not face the executioner's block. I officially revoke the mandate of their deaths. Extract them from this lightless rot today. Cleanse them. Prepare them. Relocate the entire faction to a more suitable, secure accommodation above ground. They will soon learn exactly how they are meant to serve Drea." Deep within the confines of his own mind, Ilazar was screaming. This usurper is openly spitting on the legacy of her own father. She is actively desecrating the very foundations of the state. The sheer audacity of arming a known rebellion with comfort and purpose was political suicide. He could not hold his tongue. The survival of the bureaucracy demanded intervention. Great Matriarch, Elazar interjected, his voice trembling, not just with fear, but with genuine, unadulterated outrage. Are you entirely certain of this decree? This reckless decision critically jeopardizes the survival of Drea. It lays a fertile foundation for 1,000 different catastrophes. I implore you, are you certain? Luria whipped around, her posture transforming instantly from calculated diplomat to apex predator. Who do you think you are to question my decree, Elazar? Remove yourself from my sight at once. But the old statesman held his ground, driven by a desperate, tragic loyalty to a bygone era. It was your father's mandate. Please, my lady, I beg of you to reconsider. As your chief advisor, as the man who helped build this very infrastructure, I am pleading with you to review this madness. Our borders are surrounded by vicious enemies. To invite such deep, internal rot, it will cripple Drea from the inside out. He sounded pathetic. He sounded utterly desperate. In a blur of sudden, terrifying violence, Luria lunged. She seized the heavy embroidered collar of Elazar's expensive silken robes, her grip like a vice of cold iron. Behind her, the sharp metallic hiss of drawn steel echoed through the dungeon as the 3 honor guards pulled their broadswords half out of their scabbards, waiting only for a single nod to sever the advisor's head from his shoulders. Luria pulled the terrified man close, her lips mere inches from his trembling face. "The ones who wound Drea," she hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venomous contempt, "are the ones too blind to perceive the gears of the innovative wheel turning right in front of them." And then she struck him. It was a vicious, resounding slap across the face. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh echoed violently down the cell blocks. It was not a blow meant to kill, but a strike engineered to inflict maximum, paralyzing humiliation. She struck her highest-ranking official, the architect of the kingdom's administration, right in front of the lowest, most despised slaves of the realm. Elazar did not die. He did not fall. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his burning cheek. But in that exact, agonizing fraction of a second, something inside the old statesman permanently snapped. The fragile, terrified bureaucrat, who had spent decades cowering in the shadows of tyrants, evaporated into the damp air. The true fox awoke. This was the catalyst. This was the point of absolute, irreversible rupture. A profound, lethal metamorphosis took place within the dark corridors of his mind, completely invisible to the matriarch and her guards. "You deform the majestic architecture of the kingdom," his internal voice whispered, suddenly devoid of all panic, replaced by a cold, mathematical hatred. "You disregard the wisdom of your father. You assign your shadowhounds to track my every movement. And now, you strike a statesman of the High Council like a disobedient dog before the livestock. This ends here. He was a creature of the state. He had breathed, bled, and sacrificed his entire life for the longevity of Drea. He had meticulously woven the political and cultural fabric that she now stood upon, and she was actively attempting to burn it to the ground. I will show you the true cost of your arrogance. There will be no more fear. There is no turning back. I will cut this cancer short, and I will do it with my own hands. There will be no more defensive maneuvering, no more desperate pleading, only the silent, terminal strike. You do not treat a bureaucrat of my tenure with such vile disrespect. A terrifying, absolute conviction settled over his soul. If Luria exists, Drea cannot. When Ilazar lowered his hand from his stinging cheek, his entire demeanor had shifted. The desperate trembling was gone. The frantic energy had vanished. He straightened his robes with slow, methodical precision. When he spoke, his voice was chillingly smooth, entirely devoid of the emotional desperation he had displayed seconds before. "As you desire, my lady." Ilazar bowed, the gesture picture-perfect in its subservience. "You know what is best for Drea, and you alone possess the vision to guide it. Please forgive my profound insolence. I swear to you, such an outburst will never happen again." He spoke the words flawlessly, the perfect picture of a chastened servant. But behind his eyes, the death warrant of the Matriarch had already been signed, sealed, and delivered to the darkest corners of his treacherous mind. The suffocating weight of the oubliette began to lift as the party ascended the narrow, spiraling throat of the fortress. The damp granite walls, weeping with the misery of centuries, finally gave way to the dry, sun-scorched stone of the upper citadel. As they emerged into the vast, open-air courtyard, the transition was jarring. The brilliant, unforgiving light of the Drea sun struck the silver of Luria's crown with a blinding intensity, while the sudden rush of fresh, mountain-born air felt like a physical shock after the stagnant, recycled rot of the dungeons. Luria walked with a predator's grace, her boots clicking sharply against the polished flagstones. She didn't pause to admire the sprawling capital beneath them, or the majestic architecture of her seat of power. Her mind was already miles away, tracing the jagged lines of the kingdom's borders and calculating the weight of lives against the cold efficiency of her grand design. "Drea possesses a staggering surplus of slave labor," she began, her voice carrying easily in the crisp air. She didn't look at Ilazar, yet she knew he was shadowing her with the unnatural, silent precision of a ghost. "My calculations indicate that to continue feeding these thousands, to squander our resources on maintaining their meager lives while simultaneously assigning them tasks that rightfully belong to the citizens of Drea, it is an unnecessary drain on our vitality. It is a structural inefficiency I will no longer tolerate." Ilazar, his face a mask of perfect, chilling subservience, despite the burning bruise still throbbing on his cheek, bowed his head. The fox within him sat perfectly still, observing the shifting tides of her madness, measuring the depth of the rupture she was creating in the ancient laws of the realm. "Whatever command you deem appropriate, my lady, I shall mobilize the bureaucracy instantly. The machinery of the state is your instrument. It awaits only your impulse." Luria came to a halt at the edge of the courtyard, overlooking the sheer drop of the citadel walls. The forced laborers in the iron mines, the construction battalions in the southern provinces, the agricultural thralls in the fertile plains, cull them. Half of every sector is to be mobilized immediately. She turned her blindfolded face toward the distant, hazy horizon. "Dispatch them to the frontier, every single one of them. Once they reach the limits of our territory, they are to be stripped of their shackles and cast out. I wish to observe exactly how our neighbors in Siram navigate this sudden, massive tide of the wretched and the unwanted. Let us see if their famed stability can withstand a migration of this magnitude. We shall weaponize their own desperation against those who watch us from the shadows." Ilazar didn't blink. The strategy was clear. She was not merely clearing the ledgers, she was launching a silent invasion. "It shall be as you command, Matriarch. The deportations will begin by dawn."